Hello, everybody. This is Peter. Welcome to the January 6th, 2010 radio address. Hope everyone out there is doing well. I'm still recovering from bronchitis, so I'm trying my best to settle my throat so I don't bother everyone with coughing. But I am feeling better, fortunately. I've made a note to myself to take better care of myself in general. I'm sure many of you have the same tendency as I do to kind of forget about your health when you're busy doing stuff. And at this point in time with me, I'm kind of overwhelmed in general, so I have to definitely make a note to self to not allow myself to get sick like this again. So anyway, I'm probably going to be going a little slow today to keep things at ease, but we've got quite a bit to talk about. For this broadcast, it will be just me answering questions, talking about a few issues. Next week, in fact, I'm going to be at the Venus Project, and I will be, actually, I think Jacques Roxanne and I are going to, in fact, be doing a roundtable radio broadcast, in fact, from the Venus Project, and we'll have a unique radio show, I think, with the three of us discussing relevant topics all together. So that should be good. First thing, Zeitgeist Day. We are officially launched with Zeitgeist Day. What do I mean by that? Meaning that all energy now should be put towards Zeitgeist Day 2010. And this, for all of you out there that have been, feeling dormant and, wondering what you can do to help this cause, this is the time of year where it becomes paramount to get involved and to start spreading this information in whatever way you can. We have a website that is officially launched right now. It's about 90% complete, but it's completely functional. There's some information that needs to be added, but I want everyone to go to zday2010.org, zday2010.org, and you can see the website that has been constructed. I want to give a deep thanks to Anya and Daniel, who have volunteered their time to put this thing together. It's truly a fantastic, simple site that will make it very easy for people to submit events. I'm not going to run down everything that the site contains. As you'll notice, as you navigate links, such as the event guide, which I'm working on with Gilbert to make a nice, concise layout of how to approach your events, there are a few things that are missing, but the basic functionality is there. So if you want to submit an event, it's a clean slate right now. There's a simple process you go through to do so. Hopefully all the bugs are worked out. The next 2 days we're going to make sure everything is clean. If there is a problem with it, there's an email that you can email us about at zday210@thezeitgeistmovement.com, which you can find that information, I believe, on the What is Z-Day information page. So this is there, and I'm really happy to see it. I think it's going to be wonderful, and it should be very fluid for everyone. And I won't spend too much more time on that, but I want to thank again those that were involved in preparing this. I really think it looks great, and it should be fantastic to see that map, the Z-Day map, begin to fill up, because I have a feeling we're going to get a great response this year. So, that point denoted, I also want to talk about Zeitgeist Day in New York. You'll notice, again, if you go to the website zday2010.org, the New York main event is still pending. It's coming soon. I'm in negotiations with 2 possible venues. As I mentioned last broadcast, the main venue that had 8,000 square feet I wanted to utilize for this big Venus Project Symposium, unfortunately fell out. I was very upset by this. There were technical issues, and it was a bummer because, unfortunately, to deal with the amount of people that would come to this event, as per what happened last year, I have to have a very large event space in New York to make it happen. And unfortunately, in New York City, there are tons of venues, but when it comes to large spaces, there's a threshold where you go from 1,000 people to 5,000, 25,000. And when it comes to spaces that are interactive, it became even more problematic. So to make a long story short, the Venus Project Symposium itself is going to be postponed until 2011. That's all I could do to think of this. And in fact, I think when it comes to strategy, this is probably a better bet. My intention for the Venus Project, my intention for Zeitgeist Day is to have a longer interactive event, which could take on a mini symposium, depending on how things unfold, considering the spaces I'm looking at. But it will be more of an all-day event, most likely, in New York, where there will be talks given for the entire day by various people on various subjects. So that is the state of that. But my new film, Zeitgeist Moving Forward, that's the title, will be coming out in October of this year, and basically that is going to give great momentum, I think, for the symposium for 2011. So in hindsight, I think it's actually going to be kind of a good thing that we wait a year for such a large-scale, highly expensive, and what will be an incredibly highly publicized event. So that's the state of that. And I apologize that it's worked out that way. I was very much looking forward to doing it this year, but as the natural gravity of things unfold, I think it's actually going to be more strategic for 2011. However, this year is still critically important. In fact, Zeitgeist Day of this year is more important than the last 2 years, that's for sure, because unlike last year, we do have active chapters, we have teams that are working diligently, we have lots of people doing tremendous work, so I think it's going to be great to see how this materializes through time as far as the event days. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say about that issue. I'm going to be talking a lot more about the preparation for Zeitgeist Day and every broadcast and giving updates on this. Once again, this is our central focus. So I want everyone out there to begin working on how to expand awareness, gravitating towards this day, press releases, contacting media. I'm hiring huge PR people. This is a very, very critical worldwide event day. We want to get worldwide acclaim for this event to really start to solidify these ideas in people's minds that are not familiar with what's happening in the world today. On a technical note, we have an international chapters meeting headed by Gilbert utilizing TeamSpeak 3 that is going to be at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, which is about an hour and a half after this show will end. And one thing I wanted to jump into before I go into questions is an issue that's important regarding what is essentially the collapse of modern society. I've been doing research on Dr. King Hubbert. Some of you might know this individual because of the book Hubbert's Peak, which was produced many years ago. Hubbert was a physicist and geologist who talked about the peak of oil in the 1970s. He was warning about this issue in the 1940s. For those of you that are familiar with this issue, it's not something that the Zeitgeist Movement has talked about a lot in the past few months, but it's something that has been in the back of my mind for a while, along with the general utter exploitation and abuse of every single resource. In a lot of ways, we're sort of peak everything. We put it into context of the expanding population and the typical methods that are used, which basically have no recycling whatsoever. What's critical about this finite geosphere we live in at this stage, based on the technical knowledge that we have to harness now, is that we have to reuse as much as possible. And Hubbert was very much aware of this, and I'm not going to go into the paradigm shift that's required. I'm going to actually talk about this in the new film to great extent. But what I'd like to point out is something that Hubbert said when he addressed Congress in 1974, when he was when he was addressing this issue. So I'm going to read this address in part. He says, quote, "I was in New York in the 1930s. I had a box seat at the Depression. I can assure you it was a very educational experience. We shut down the country because of monetary reasons. We had manpower and abundant raw resources, yet we shut down the country. We are doing the same kind of thing now, but with a different material outlook. We are not in the position we were in 1929 and 1930 with regard to the future, when the physical system was ready to roll. This time it is not. Then the physical system was ready to roll. This time it is not. We are in a crisis in the evolution of human society. It's unique to both human and geological history. It has never happened before, and it can't possibly happen again. You can only use oil once. Soon, all the oil is going to be burned and all the metals mined and scattered. This is obviously a scenario of catastrophe, but we have the technology. All we have to do is completely overhaul our culture and find an alternative to money. We are not starting from zero. We have an enormous amount of existing technical knowledge. It is just a matter of putting it all together. We still have great flexibility with our maneuverability. We still have great flexibility, but our maneuverability will diminish with time. A non-catastrophic solution is impossible unless society is made stable. This means abandoning two axioms of our culture: the current work ethic and the idea that growth is a normal state of life. Our window of opportunity is slowly closing. At the same time, it probably requires a spiral of adversity. In other words, things have to get a lot worse before they get better. This is someone that was incredibly privy to a very important element of our society, and that's money, not to mention the resource depletion and abstraction. I'd like to read another quote by him that was in a paper called Two Intellectual Systems, Matter Energy and the Monetary Culture. He writes, "The world's present industrial civilization is handicapped by the coexistence of two universal, overlapping, and incompatible intellectual systems: the accumulated knowledge of the last 4 centuries of the properties and interrelationships of matter and energy, and the associated monetary culture which has evolved from folkways of prehistoric origin." So, I think that pretty much says it all. This is fascinating to me because this is an individual that saw something that I can't believe I hadn't discovered before, frankly. You'll notice that, generally speaking, we haven't focused, as I've said just a moment ago, that much on the collapse. As regard to fiscal stuff we know that the monetary system is spiraling out of control because of the very because of the very nature of its construction. This is absolutely apparent. We are facing global bankruptcy. In fact, the whole world is already bankrupt. And all they're really doing now is trying to sweep as much under the carpet as they possibly can. We know that the world requires infinite growth to maintain the system. Economic expansion is really an illusion. It's an action-reaction scenario. You can't have expansion without contraction in this environment, which means that there's a constant wealth shift from the poor to the rich, because that's the natural gravity of the system. And you cannot have any form of growth without it leading to demise. That starts to sound redundant, but it goes to show that the more growth you have, the larger the catastrophe that's about to happen. And this also applies to what we've done with the natural resources, unfortunately. And when you combine these together, when you combine the infinite growth system of the monetary system, which is required to sustain essentially all jobs, as I made the examples in the presentations that I've done, you can have an individual that gets money, he starts a company, he gets employees, the employees produce goods, the goods are sold. But what happens when all that initial money is stripped away from the individual? Then all the jobs are lost. Purchasing power is destroyed. So the people that lose the jobs also can't purchase things. I don't want to belabor all of that because I've already gone into it many, many times, but the system is based on infinite growth, coupled in with a geosphere that is in fact finite. So we're heading towards utter catastrophe, and this is something I'm going to be talking about a lot more because it's something I've kind of been on the sidelines about. I will go ahead and admit that many years ago I didn't believe in peak oil. I found it to be too much in the advantage of the oil industry for people to think this way. But I've been educated on this more cleanly, and I've had my mind expanded to understand that we are destroying resources, and the very logic to assume that you have a finite resource that takes millions of years to generate, and you have a population that's growing exponentially, and you have an obvious statistical understanding that we're using more oil, or we will eventually use more oil than can possibly be produced at an equivalent amount of time by the Earth, goes to show that even if we weren't at a point of peak, it is still unsustainable and it is still an incorrect practice. The only issue now is trying to stop the system and to utilize the remaining oil to alter our infrastructure radically so we can bring on all of the alternatives necessary to continue sustaining the population. Otherwise, I fear that you're going to see essentially a die-off. You're going to see a die-off of you're going to see a die-off of people, unfortunately, because everything that has sustained this population is being slowly eroded until and unless we make a dramatic change, which is exactly what we're trying to do. Okay, so I'm going to go into your questions right now. Number one. Wow, here's actually one that was perfect in context of what I was just saying. It says, after watching the film you recommended Collapse, what are the plans of converting our current society into a new society when the majority means of production are still based on oil? How could we transform a society without the use of oil? There are a lot of people out there that have already approached this issue. We can make plastics that are not from oil. Tires do not necessarily have to come from, rubber does not necessarily have to come from oil. The problem is the infrastructure is not in place to make these transitions, and the monetary system is holding all of this back cataclysmically. Far too much money will be made as the society is destroyed by the upper 1%, which will basically remove the incentive of people to to the bigger institutions to want to make this change because they don't have the altruism that's required. They don't have the foresight. They don't care because as we all know, the entire society reinforces self-interest. That's what the whole game is about. So, that is the problem. We have to overcome the economics paradigm first. The economic paradigm has to go. There's no solution otherwise. There might be some in-between things, but in transition, we have to move past the social normality of our medium of exchange and reward. Otherwise, again, the upper 1% will make far too much money while the rest of the world dies. So that's really the issue. As far as technical solutions, they do exist. They absolutely exist. And it's just a matter of, and I'm going to talk about this a lot in the new film, it's simply a matter of getting the world to wake up that we have to stop our current practices. Keep in mind that the monetary system is just that, a game. The monetary game is just that, a game. It's not real. It's a system of arbitrary rules that have been set up that have a cause and effect reality that are utterly contrived. We could stop it immediately. It could be just literally stopped, like a bunch of dominoes falling and you just stick your hand and you stop the dominoes from going any further. It's really that simple. But I don't think I have to relay to all of you how complex that is given the power establishment that's happening, that's in existence right now. Number two. Hi, Peter. I know of a website which pays monthly commissions to those who refer customers to them. The idea I am working is how can we obtain websites, place content on them which promotes awareness of the Zeitgeist Movement, the Venus Project, and each refer a few other people online we know and come to know, inviting them to the movement and referring them to the company to do likewise. Get a website, promote the awareness on it, and refer a few others. The result of this would be spreading awareness of the movement via these websites, and each of us earning monthly incomes as we proceed. Well, I really don't believe that at this stage that's required. It isn't the position of the movement to support people at this stage. Our position of support is to create larger overhauls that change the system at a foundational level. I am all about trying to create programs to help resolve some of the growing atrocities. There are a lot of unique things. There's a project that was started by Gilbert called World Hunger Can Be Solved. This is basically an advertisement type of mechanism. It's a way to lure people into the overarching ideas that we talk about. But it is something that could be addressed very liberally and literally as well, because there are many things that could be done by governing bodies to help what's happening across the world. I mean, we are at a position of mass starvation already. I hope everyone recognizes that. We have about 12% of the world's population starving to death. People don't seem to really think about it this way just because what they see on the media. But those larger issues are much more important. I'm not in the business of trying to make a network for just a small group to survive. We're in the business of trying to change society as a whole. But while I appreciate what you're saying, the movement is contingent upon people having their own resources and time to help move forward and promote this direction, just as I do, just as all of the other volunteers do. Time, of course, in our system is money, which makes things more complex, but it's just one of those problems that we all have to work through. And believe me, that's something that I deal with every day. So I would have to say I don't like the idea of creating anything that has any type of monetary acquisition, because the first thing that monetary acquisition always does is create corruption. Everything money touches turns to shit, period. Doesn't matter how altruistic anyone is. Once their survival is contingent upon the income based on some medium, they are entered in a position of dishonesty, because profiting always comes at the expense of someone else. There's no equality. The only supposed ethics that exists has to do with the redefinition of ethics, meaning that that's, quote, just the way things are, if that makes any sense. Number 3. Hi, Peter. My question deals with the idea of nature versus nurture. You have stated in the past that you believe nurture is accountable for about 90% of our human behavior and the other 10% to be associated with nature. Correct me if I am wrong. Well, let me stop you right there. Actually, you continue. First off, I would like to ask if those numbers are merely a representation of what you believe, or is there scientific evidence backing those numbers? Yeah, I'll stop you right there. Basically, that's an arbitrary distinction. It's just to show a qualifier, not necessarily a quantifier. I guess I could rephrase that in verbal terms to make it seem less mathematical. You have to understand that, so to answer your question, no, it's not scientific. I'm not really put off by that type of distinction, because it's just the symbolic reference of the relationship of nature versus nurture when it comes to actual human action, which is human behavior. Let me continue with the second part of your question. Second off, what does all the nature aspect of our behavior include? I'm aware of Tourette syndrome and other heredity ailments, but are ailments and other diseases all that nature deals with? Human nature could be defined as the the autonomous aspects of your nervous system. You are pre-wired based on your nature for certain organs to perform certain functions. So your heart beats not because you're thinking about it, though there are some Buddhist monks that can control their heartbeat, which goes to show you can overcome certain aspects perhaps. But that's beside the point. Basically, the nature aspect comes to the fact that there are genetic propensities that you have that keep your body working and make certain aspects of performance contingent upon biological restraints. As the example I used in my London lecture, you can't, no matter how much time I would spend trying to teach a cat to learn to speak English, I simply can't do it because of the inherent biological restraints of that organism. But I can't help but go ahead and point out that the reason I use this 90% to 10% is to show that when it comes to our behavior and our value systems and everything that I continually reiterate about, and Jacques reiterates about the importance of the environment, 90% of our actions come from what we learn around us. It's really nothing complex. You don't need a computer to figure it out. Every word coming out of my mouth has been taught to me. Every aspect of my sentence structure, accent, and dialect, it comes from the region and influence that I have. Every concept that I am relaying is a conglomerate of ideas that have been inserted into my mind, coupled in with logic and reason that I have acquired based on a particular reference, that essentially orchestrate my train of thought to output information based on the tools that have been provided. Nothing just appears out of nowhere. There's no spontaneous creativity. Granted, we do live in a five-sense reality. There are lots of things hitting us from all sides that we might not be consciously aware of. I admit that, while it's very difficult to really scientifically pinpoint those issues. But I'm a walking composite of my life experience, and this is what we talked about continuously. You have aspects like testosterone, which could be coupled in with the nature argument. Dr. Robert Sapolsky, along with some other scientists in Japan, just recently came out with studies that testosterone does not cause aggression. Testosterone can magnify aggressive aspects that are intercepted from the environment. Same thing goes with a lot of other neurochemicals and hormones. It seems utterly transparent to me. I mean, the other people that try to argue against the nature aspect, they look at the twin studies. The twin studies are very interesting and also very ambiguous. I've been very unimpressed by the twin studies And I've had some interesting conversations with anthropologists and biologists about these studies. A lot of them really don't put much evidence on them. Obviously, there are always going to be genetic aspects that affect people's behavior, but it's the environment that triggers those aspects. So it's always an interaction, don't get me wrong. But when you look at somebody and you ask why they behave the way they do, why they beat up somebody that was of a different race, why they work in the fields that they do, why they talk the way they do, why they engage in the relationships that they do, these are all culturally produced manifestations. As a slight aside, an example I gave before, there was a study in the 15th century, there was a 15th century king in Europe, I can't remember his name right now, I apologize, who wanted to find out what the universal language was of the human being. So what he did, with all of his wealth, he acquired a number of babies, infants, and he put them in separate chambers in his castle, and he made sure that the babies never heard any language whatsoever, under the assumption that these babies would grow and begin to speak on their own accord, such as the natural human language, hence nature rather than nurture, showing its relevance. And what happened is that because of the lack of human contact, because of the lack of environment that was created, granted, these kids were given good clothes, they were given great food, but they were not given much human contact because of the fear that the children someone would speak and the children would pick up words very quickly and it would destroy the experiment. And what was amusing is that all the children died. None of them lived. They didn't grow very well. They basically just withered away and died, because there's other aspects that come into play that are required, which again couples both the nature and nurture argument, meaning that if the nature aspect doesn't interact with the nurture aspect, then they won't happen. They won't occur. And you see this with feral children as well. So while there is a generally equal relationship on an abstract level of the nature-nurture element, obviously you have to have a biologically defined system, which is nature. But unless the environment, the nurture aspect, comes into play, it's almost like there's nothing to trigger the nature aspect. I hope this makes sense and doesn't sound too obnoxious. But basically that's it. And it's really quite obvious when you think about it. So I hope that answers your question. I apologize for the tangent, but the 90 to 10% is a way of expressing the importance when it comes to human behavior, not just your heart beating, but when people walk around, think what they do, orchestrate their event, the jobs that they like, the interests that they have, the way they look at human relationships, the gods they believe in, their worldviews in general, the language they speak, their dialects, their accents, the way they dress, everything about the human organism that relates to their actual unfolding involvement in society is basically a product of nurture. And it becomes quite transparent. Granted, there are caveats, but that's why we talk about it. I'm not trying to pretend that I'm some scientist that can find a clinical definition of this. I'm not interested in that, honestly. All I'm interested in is what affects culture. So when people say to me, in regards to the Venus Project, well, that's against human nature to cooperate on such a grand level. People want enemies. There's always an us and them. They throw these things out there as though that they've studied and proven it. When what it comes down to is all they're doing is looking at history and saying, well, you know what? People keep fighting in history. Therefore, it must be a natural human propensity to not get along on a certain level and to seek dominance and power. And the fact of the matter is that really just isn't true. It's what the culture and environment has supported because of scarcity, because of value system trends that have been put into position because of survival instincts, because, again, fundamentally of scarcity. So, I hope that answers your question. Number 4, what is your take on science in terms of the universe or the, quote, beginning? What is the real purpose of anything besides finding out above question? Well, you've asked 3 extremely massive, overarching questions. I really couldn't spend that much time to humor those ideas because it's so very difficult to just define that. What I will say as far as universe, hold on. As far as the universe, I loved how Buckminster Fuller in his writings, he would never say the universe. He would simply say universe. he would frame sentences such as, when we examine universe, comma, etc., as opposed to when we examine the universe. The reason I find that brilliant is because universe is all-encompassing, and it's basically an all-encompassing environment, what's the word I'm looking for? Physical entity that is everything that we can think of in the given spectrum of understanding in the physical realm, or maybe even in the, especially, yeah, exactly, that's good enough. I think that's a great way to think about it, just arbitrarily speaking. As far as the beginning, we see beginnings and endings in a cyclical fashion. We see cyclicality, that's for sure, in everything. But is there really a, quote, beginning to the universe in the context that you're describing? People say the Big Bang was the beginning. Well, we all know that something had to have existed before the Big Bang. So is there really evidence to support that there's a finite nature to things? Maybe we're a part of a larger transition. Maybe when human beings are born and they die, we just don't see the continuity there. And I think it's just kind of an abstraction for us to think that things actually end. So, that's how I would say that. I can't say that I can support an empirical beginning. There's probably temporal beginnings. In fact, there are temporal beginnings that are just that artificial representations to denote cyclicality is the way I denote beginnings. As far as purpose, Jacques will tell you that there's really no purpose based on the ideas that we've concocted. We want to think that everything has meaning. It's a big philosophical debate. Jacques has great examples he uses to talk about the assumptions of purpose. As far as creation and evolution, he tends to find that purpose happens in retrospect, if you will. We're not born with eyebrows to keep sweat from going into our eyes, though it might be a natural result of that. People say we have eyes to see. Well, if you put somebody in a really dark room, do the eyes have a function at that stage? I can see the logic of this. But I think, ultimately these types of philosophical notions I don't really care for. I think there's a lot of unique procrastination that is unique to think about in a philosophical manner, but I typically at this stage don't have the convenience of considering such things, so I kind of just leave them alone. Number 5. How do you feel about chapters taking on other names as proxies? For example, our chapter created a media-face, quote, social solution. That is the name that we use for our YouTube show and the zine that's given out for free. We're also going to start making fully marketable documentaries that can generate income for other projects. I'll just go back to your question about proxy names. I like to keep things unified. I'm kind of disappointed with a lot of groups out there that have decided to bypass the Venus Project and the Zeitgeist Movement and go off on their own and think that they have better ideas and they want to detach, and we end up with a broken relationship. Most of the great social movements in history have essentially fallen because of divisions within the movements themselves, because of egos and arrogances that emerge. I'm not saying that this is what you're doing, by the way. All I'm saying is that be very careful with creating too many labels for what you're doing. I think the real power in what we're doing is to try and get everything as homogeneous as possible, so when people see information on, say, your site, they know what it's about and they know how to find more information about a resource-based economy. That's about all I could really say. I'm hoping that people will join us in the movement as far as the social activism and awareness, which is an advocation of the resource-based economy, which is the Venus Project. I'm hoping that's really as far as things need to go. The more we detach and start to spread out like this with different names, the more things are probabilistically going to change, and the more direction will become confused, and you'll have all these people doing different things and not really understanding what's going on. I noticed this immediately from questions that are gotten. There's still a great deal of confusion, and I'm trying my best to keep things as concise as possible as far as what the Zeitgeist Movement actually is. Again, this isn't a movement that is just trying to make things, quote, better. It's also a movement that recognizes that things are about to get a lot worse. And I want to make sure that's very clear. We've passed the peak, so to speak, of the modern industrial world as far as the physical and financial growth. It's all downhill from here. And I hope you understand that. I hope everyone out there really understands the crisis that is beginning to unfold. That's all I can really say. It's not that we want to just make things better. It's that either we move into a system based on resource management that is deliberate, with conservation, with strategic acquisition and distribution based on projects that have meaning, and utilizing resources in the most efficient, long-lasting way, and recycling all those resources strategically. Unless that happens, you're going to see some very, very, very scary times within the next few decades. And I think that's important to point out. This is becoming critical, and I'm going to make sure that in the new film that people really understand this. This isn't a fear-monger issue. It's important people understand that we are on a slippery slope. We're going down. All of society is. If you think unemployment in America is going to start going up, think again. If you're wondering why the stock market keeps rising, well, that's because it's highly manipulated, and all the money, the trillions of dollars that's been pushed into the banking system to try and curb the all the games that have been played that have basically destroyed the economy in one swoop, such as the credit default swaps. All of that money is going back into the system because the people in power know that the stock market is a barometer for the United States economy. It's only when the stock market starts to decline substantially that they know that the public will start to freak out. It's an old, romantic, traditionalized barometer, and I don't know if there's enough money in existence to keep the market where it is. Anyway, I'm not going to belabor all of that, but I hope everyone understands that the predicament that we're in. We're not, at this stage, it's not about making things better. It's about trying to stop what's about to happen. Number 6. Once a global economic dislocation occurs, the opportunities for educating the population on the merits of a resource-based, egalitarian social model will obviously be severely diminished, as basic survival will become the primary focus. Given the understanding that we're up against a seemingly accelerating clock, do you find that it would be in the Zeitgeist Movement's best interest to begin exerting coordinated pressure against the establishment with the almost 400,000 members we currently have? Excuse me. What an appropriate question per my last statement. I completely agree that we need to start doing something. I'm giving one last shot with my next film to give the best, most concise, less romantic, straightforward, direct approach I can to showing where we are and where we could be going, both in a positive and negative extreme. We can move into a resource-based economy where the civilization can survive and begin to shift methods dramatically and quickly, or we can watch the destruction of human civilization in a slow, grueling way. Basically, I want to have coordinated actions and pressure against the establishment. I am not going to do anything until our numbers get a little bit higher, until I see a larger global presence. The movement is at its infancy right now. We are not active yet. We are not functional as far as I'm concerned. This is the preliminary period. We've only been around for a little over a year. This is something that people have to be patient with, and they have to understand clearly what we're doing. Believe me, I have a lot of ideas, a lot of radical ideas about how to begin interacting with the establishment and make them, along with the public, understand what's happening. This certainly isn't just for fun. And basically, I can't do anything yet, though. I can't do anything yet. Believe me, I'm very much active mentally as far as how to begin to curtail what's going on before it's too late, before the point of no return has been sealed, before chaos essentially emerges. I can really just leave it at that, and I share your frustration. Number 8. Hello, Peter. What would the role of love relationships play out in a resource-based economy? I understand that it's whatever the society of the time makes of it, but I wondered how you personally felt a relationship between people should be treated. An example, when I apply logic to the concepts of monogamy, I find that is erroneous to some extent because since the values of the two people would go under constant change, they could eventually lead up to a point where the values become dissonant and leads to a separation by the very nature of change. Also, I feel monogamy somewhat suggests the notion of property because the notion, excuse me, he continues, because the notion of these two people belong, quote, to each other but I feel that polygamy may not be the answer either. Well, I don't think the answer, to answer your question, I don't think the answer is both either polygamy or monogamy. I think these are two extremes. I question whether, say, the human species is in fact monogamous. There's definitely a strong cultural aspect there. It's a complex question. I think people need to have more openness and less neuroses, I suppose, towards each other. I tend to find, in my own experience with people that I know that go through dramatic relationships, is that there's a tendency for people to want to latch on to others and want to define their happiness by someone else. And I think that that leads to some dangerous reactions. I do think that the marriage aspect is, in fact, an ownership aspect. You hear this rhetoric all the time. Well, she's my wife. It's my boyfriend. It's kind of ridiculous. I agree with Jacques that marriage was basically created so the people that had children had to look after their children. It was a form of security for society, and it was compounded by religion as well. I'm not sure which came first, frankly. But to answer your question, relationships, I think, will grow in openness, I suppose. I think monogamy is probably not a human characteristic, even though it's culturally defined. I have monogamous tendencies. It's not that there's conditions that are certainly there. I don't know. It's really a difficult question. I think in the end, people need to look at each other as what they are, and those are, as you denote, developing organisms, and that change does occur. And human relationships and human reciprocation, of course, are extremely rewarding and very important aspects as well. So there's a fine line there between attachment and an openness and a willing to let go of people if they do change, things like that. Jacques does better describe these issues than I do. I mean, he stated outright, that if in the New York Zeitgeist Day event, he basically stated something to the effect that if you really love somebody, you're willing to let them go. And I think that is a pretty profound notion. Unfortunately, there's ego aspects where people break up with somebody else and suddenly it becomes them. That's the problem. I think people might relate to that. Someone breaks up with you and then you think it's you that's the problem. Anyway, there's lots of different avenues to consider. I'm just going to leave it at that because, it's a very personal question, and I'm not going to go on any tangents about what my conditioning is. But in general, people need to listen to each other. Unfortunately, people just don't listen to each other enough in general these days and attain mutual understandings about what each other actually want. Number 9. First off, let me clarify that I do not see the Venus Project as some sort of rigid guideline for the future. That means everything you and Mr. Fresco say are mere speculation. Only then will we know how society will evolve. This is to say that even if we evolve into a resource-based economy, many of the things we discuss and come to a common agreement on may not occur. I agree. Question, once you said that you saw as possible the existence of pets in the future. Okay, hold on. Before I read that section of the question, let me address the issue that was brought up regarding these resource-based economy assumptions. Okay, well, the future that we talk about has many variances, and when Jacques Fresco's work is extremely creative in regard to harnessing specific ideals that, in fact, I think are almost as empirical as can be when it comes to the way society should function. So let me point out that when you denote that everything that we say is speculation, I'll tell you what isn't speculation. What isn't speculation is that energy is what runs technology. Energy is the fuel of society. We can either desperately seek alternative energies, even to the extent where we can get energies that are so powerful that it's in such abundance we don't have to even worry about it. There are very complex forms of energy interests that I'm looking into to talk about that far exceed geothermal, solar, and everything else. There are many possibilities. But energy is the driving force of human civilization. The next level is technology and the use of material resources that are unfortunately finite to create the tools that we need to move forward and prosper and to make our lives easier and, of course, to make things efficient and supply everyone with what they need. Those two aspects are non-negotiable. Those two aspects are not speculation. Everything Jacques Fresco talks about is about harnessing those attributes, conserving those attributes, using them in the most pristine, effective way, excuse me, pristine is the wrong word, the most efficient way possible. That's it. Everything else stems from it in different ways, and unless you understand that framework, I can see how someone might be confused. You know, they see the cities, they see the nice houses, and they don't understand why Jacques is using foam concrete. They don't understand why there's a circular function. They think it's just some idealism. They don't understand the foundation of it. Everything that Jacques has designed has a utility. In fact, that's really all there is utility. I believe art will be born from utility eventually. It will be looked upon. The most utility form of creation will actually transcend abstraction, I believe. But I'll leave that for you to consider. The third component is the human mind, which is the greatest resource on the planet. The human mind and its discovery of a train of thought called the scientific method. Those three attributes are non-negotiable. Either humans are educated to understand how the world works so they can understand understand the reasons for conserving energy, for finding the most efficient means to produce energy, to maintain energy, the most efficient, conservative, and productive means to utilize material tools, technology, automation, robotics, and create things that help us, to do all-out farming aspects that do not destroy the world. The very fact that we've destroyed most of the topsoil on this planet because of our monocultures and fertilizers is just so deplorable, I don't even know where to begin. These are not speculation. There's no speculation in any of this. This is why Jacques always comes back to the idea of arriving at decisions, because once the goal is absolute human sustainability, once the people of the world stop fighting each other because of race, religion, creed, class, sex, and everything else, once they understand that they have to work together if they expect to see any form of stabilization, and they have to focus their energy on preservation and maximum efficiency and basically just that, once the goal is survival of the species, then everything becomes self-evident. So there's no speculation on that level. Now, answer the second part of your question. Question, once you said you saw as possible the existence of pets in the future, but are not pets a form of owning life? Can life be owned? I accept that animals can be killed to be eaten or to give man products if there is no other way around it, but we should never consider those animals as being ours. Having pets is exactly this, the perpetuation of the mindset in which man can own everything. Okay. Basically, you have to ask yourself, does the pet know it's owned? The pet doesn't know it's owned. It's a relationship. The pets have no idea it's owned. In fact, there's a funny Jerry Seinfeld stand-up routine where he talks about an alien looking down at the planet and watching a man walk his dog, and the dog goes to the bathroom, and the man picks up the waste and throws it away, and the alien would have to ask the question, who's actually in charge? Domestication is really a mutual relationship an interspecies mutual relationship, so to speak. It's not a matter of ownership. Granted, unfortunately, abuses occur in any kind of relationship, and it's unfortunate that animals can be abused. But people have a lot of respect for their pets. In fact, most people that really love their pets tend to treat their pets better than a lot of their friends, I've found. So, this has nothing to do with ownership. It has nothing to do with anything like that. It's an interspecies relationship and nothing more. I don't believe it perpetuates a mindset of ownership. The animal gains something from each other. The human being gains companionship. The animal gains food and health, probably exceeding what they would find out in the wild, at least in the urban society. So anyway, I'm just going to leave it at that. Number 10. Hi, Peter. Currently, we have the creative team, communication team, and important strides in this direction, but I believe it would be positive to create a team of investigation that brings together psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, and others with the mission to address and propose possible solutions to certain problems of society, for example, murderers, rapists, incest, and so on. These complex problems are not solved by declaring the land as the common heritage of all living things. I personally cannot imagine a better world without having solved these problems. You've hit that's a tremendous question, and you've hit a wonderful angle that is very complex, and it's something that we do have to deal with. And it becomes down to education more than anything else. I will state that I believe 95% of the majority of crimes that exist on the planet today are monetary related. The other 5% are complex, jealousy, neurotic crimes that unfortunately exceed exactly what you talk about. And I completely agree that you do need experts in the field of sociology to come forward and to begin to address these issues. There's a great book that Jacques gave me that I recommend if you want to get a sort of inside look of serial killers. And it's called The Show of Violence. And it's written, I believe, by a court psychologist who dealt with serial killers. And he was able to pinpoint some of the root causes of some of these behaviors. And what you tend to find with serial killers, as a general example, is that there's something dramatic that usually happens to these people. And while I don't dismiss things like schizophrenia and genetic predispositions that do occur, the issue really comes down to environment. But it's a very complex environment, and I admit that. I think if we can get rid of 95% of the problems in the world today due to money, we can certainly hone in on these other issues. A lot of people like to dismiss our ideas because they think that if we can't solve everything, then it's not worth moving forward. And that's a very disappointing disposition. Jealousy, rape, these are horrible attributes that are they're neuroses that are generated both from culture and from genetics. I throw in genetics there because I think it's important, because schizophrenia and social distortion, obsessive compulsive aspects, these are real genetic issues that do affect people's behavior. And that's one of the areas where I think it's very important to realize the effect. It's also very few and far between. It's very, very rare that these things occur. There's not that many of these crimes that exist when you consider the whole of population, unless you go into really sick environments such as the tribalism and the cultural tribalism, where women are held as objects and rape is a commonplace thing, say in certain aspects of Africa. That's just sad, a very sad cultural world. But when it comes to a less distorted society in the Western world, where people are more civil, I suppose, for lack of a better expression, these things come from neuroses, and I completely agree. And when Jacques has talked about this in many ways, and as we've noted, if someone, say a rapist, was obtained, they'd be taken into custody. They wouldn't be thrown into a concrete cell. They would be analyzed. They would be removed from society. These are things that would happen in the transition. The real leap, though, in the transition is the fact that we can get rid of 95% of the majority of the crimes. Remember, 60% of the people in prisons are nonviolent drug offenders, and if that doesn't make you just enraged, I don't know what else would, because drug offenses are really a sickness of mind. It's a cultural product. There's probably some relationship to a propensity for addicts to exist, but culture is supplying and reinforcing these, and it's a sad, sad world. We really could do so much if we can just get rid of the monetary system and then focus on the true problems of the human organism, such as the things that you discuss, which could be overcome both medically and could be overcome with great therapeutic realizations and, again, family upbringings. A Show of Violence is a great book to discuss some of these issues. Number 11. And by the way, I would love to create a team of people to consider this. Unfortunately, we're still in our infancy, so I really just can't create a team that can think this way, because we don't have the power to pull in people that have these problems and to begin to treat them. It's far beyond what we can do right now. But believe me, I think that's a terrific point, and it's something that needs to be addressed in the future, by all means. If we lived in a sane society, this is what would have already happened. It happens in slight ways, but unfortunately, it's not dominant. The real sickness of mind is really a health issue. It's all of it, in fact, is a mental health issue, and all of it does have resolution unless you have such a severe mental syndrome where it's simply beyond the environment. Then you have to try to take care of the person as best you can in an environment that keeps them contained so they don't hurt anybody else. We're not seeking a utopia, and I hope no one has gotten this angle or assumed this is what we're doing. This isn't utopia. There are always going to be problems in the transition. In fact, everything is always a transition in general. We want to reduce as much as possible. Where you get to a point, for example, in the future where when someone gets murdered, it happens maybe once a year on the entire planet. I think that's possible. I really think it's possible that we can create a standard of living and a educational system that makes such things seem so atrocious, so insane, sort of the way we think about really, really sick neuroses and distortion today, such as, I don't know, necrophilia. There are instances that occur every year that you hear reports on of people that engage in necrophilia. If you don't know what that is, it means having sex with dead people. And basically, it's very, very few and far between, isn't it? You don't hear about it that often. And I think things like murder will become just as abstract and sickening to the cultures of the future as the way we look at necrophilia, and the sparse aspect of that occurrence will become just as evident. Will become the trend. Sorry, I'm not explaining myself very well. And I apologize for keep coughing on the phone. I'm trying to get it away. All right, number 11. Hey, Peter, how did you come to know the banking system so well? I would like to know how it works in my country, New Zealand, so that my understandings are relevant to my country and also when I'm going to explain this to other people. I'm not reverting back to the way it works in America. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I misread that. I want to make sure I don't revert back to the way it works in America when I explain it to people in New Zealand. Also, I'm very interested in human behavior and social structure. What would be a good avenue to go down in terms of something to study? Sociology or anthropology? Good avenue. The human behavior, social structure stuff, there's some tremendous work by Michael actually, hold on, I can't state that name because I don't have it in front of me. I'm sorry, I should have prepared for that question. I really recommend the works of Dr. Robert Sapolsky. He's written 4 books. The Problem with Testosterone is a good one. A Primate's Memoir is actually a biography of him. That's not one to get. All of his books do some really good angles, have some really good angles on the human behavior aspect. As far as sociology and social structure, there's a study, Richard Wilkinson. Richard Wilkinson has written a few books on social organization, especially stratification, which I really recommend. So I think Robert Sapolsky and Wilkinson would be great for you to start to consider those issues. And as far as the banking system, that information has been out there for a long time. It's just that no one really understands it, and people are typically bored and frightened, or they don't even think about stuff like this. I would say there's a book by Ellen Brown, which I based part 1 of Zeitgeist Addendum on, called Web of Debt. Web of Debt was probably the best, most concise book I had seen, which does a terrific job of showing the overarching aspect of what's happened. There are other books by G.R. Griffin which are good, but The Creature from Jekyll Island, I would ignore the second half when he gets into some very biased notions, but his general disposition on the monetary system is accurate. He gets into social aspects, which I think are ludicrous. But ultimately, I think Web of Debt is probably a great place to start. And then from there, start looking at references if you want to move forward, because there's lots of other books that have been written throughout time that deal with these issues. New Zealand, you can rest assured, uses a fractional reserve lending system. I suspect they're not as haphazard as the United States because of the paradigm the United States is in. But I guarantee you that if you go to whatever the Central Bank of New Zealand is, and you look at their information, you'll find information on their use of the fractional reserve lending system. If they're not, I'll be truly shocked because in my research, there's only maybe 2 or 3 countries on the planet that don't use the system, and they're typically very, very small. Number 12. Hi, Peter. Complex question. We'll try to get as concise as possible. Most opponents of the movement criticize the absence of any material that covers the use of power and politics during the transition. I agree that politics would be useless in a resource-based economy, but before we'd be able to get there, there would be multiple reasons for the use of politics. 1, assuring that people continue working on jobs nobody wants to do. 2, fighting crime. 3, managing scarcity. Okay. Already now there are some complaints about... let me make sure this is what I'm reading correctly. Okay, let me continue. Already now there are some complaints about chapter leaders misusing their power, and I guess we'd see this on a great scale if we built the Venus Project City without any plan for leadership. Okay, you know what, I apologize. There's some bleeding over that I've seen here. So, excuse me. The question I was going to answer had to do with politics in transition and the issues that were pointed up. Assuming people want to continue to do jobs, fighting crime, managing scarcity. In the transition, the political structure is not going to vanish. We all know that. Obviously, we want to influence politics without becoming political. This is not a political movement, it's a social movement. If you don't know what that means, please look up social movement as opposed to political movement. I've gotten bizarre emails that try to say that we're a political movement, and I'm not running for office. I don't know anybody here that's running for office. I'm not interested in procuring a position in office as much as trying to influence the entire structure as a whole. Influencing particular political officials, of course, is very important. I am up for talking to anyone that wants to talk about this in the political realm. No doors are closed. If there was, for example, a resource-based economy advocate that did want to enter politics, I certainly wouldn't stand in their way. But you have to understand that you don't want to engage a system that you're trying to remove. You don't want to. It's very, very difficult for people to change things from the inside. It's a very common thing that's assumed, but it just doesn't typically happen. There's so many complex things, so many complex parameters that come into play once you're in something like that. I'm not saying it can't be done, but to answer your question, politics is, of course, important, and I think more important to what you're saying as far as, like, for example, fighting crime. It's not politics as much as law enforcement does need to continue, but we want to create a pattern, a trend where law enforcement becomes less and less necessary, where the necessities of life are slowly created and handed over to everyone, reducing monetary crime. What I see this, if there was a fluid transition, it would work like, it would work to the effect where over time, every year, prison populations would get less and less. The number of police on the street would get less and less. You would slowly see the removal of central intelligence agencies. The FBI would no longer exist. Well, mainly because the corporate collusion and Wall Street systems that they are basically in sponsorship of would slowly fade away as well. Eventually, Wall Street would be gone. The stock market would be bulldozed. There would be no one trading currencies anymore. You would see a slow gravitation towards a new system. Do I think it will actually happen like that? No. Though I am going to try and propose ideas that could allow that to happen. We all know that it's going to take something fairly cataclysmic to wake the society up, to shake up the beehive, if you will. So to answer your question without going on too much of a tangent, I would say that you have to keep the current system in its place and to use it whatever way possible. The political system is going to have to be influenced, and in some way it's going to have to be altered. I don't know how it's going to happen, but all I know is that it's not working the way it is, and it's not going to work in the future. Politicians do not know anything about resource management or the things that actually support human life directly. All they can do is allocate budgets to teams of actual scientists that are given leeway to do what they think should be done, and usually they're simply guided for the political purposes. Anyway, I'm not going to harp on all of that, but I understand your question. I apologize if I'm a little disoriented today. I'm still trying to get rid of this cold with the bronchitis, but hopefully I'm making some kind of sense today. Number 13, already now there are some complaints about chapter leaders misusing their power, and I guess we'd see this on a great scale if we built a Venus Project type city without any plan for leadership. All right, I'll continue. Any form of democracy basically puts anyone in charge. Who knows how to influence the masses? And the absence of politics tends to increase the danger of this process. On the other hand, educating people to question everything would take decades, if it would even work, which I don't believe. I do think we would need a planned government that is only allowed to act based on a set of cybernetic goals that are measurable and serve all society. Yes, I basically agree. I'm not quite sure what to say about that. And that is an extension of the prior question, even though it brings up another point. I'm just going to skip addressing that because I don't even know how to answer that, how to continue to answer that. The Venus Project type city, first of all, is going to be managed. It does have a leadership, but leadership comes in the form of management. It isn't people dictating things. It's people making sure everything's working. It's very simple. It's not a matter of power abuse, as you allude to chapter leaders. Chapter leaders are doing their best to get people working together to do something. Unfortunately, we have to have people orienting things, hence the definition of leadership. Leadership is important at this stage, even though I like to not call myself a leader. I'm trying to get people organized, and that has a leadership role. That is, unfortunately, the nature of any kind of organization. Otherwise, everybody running around in circles, not knowing what to do. As far as your notion of democracy, democratic processes in the absence of politics. Well, first of all, you could separate democracy from politics entirely. And in fact, I would redefine democracy in the context of what we're describing as being a survey of the necessities of people, not war and all the things that we associate with democracy now. In other words, when people engage in democratic, quote, democratic elections, they're typically not thinking about, they're thinking about their self-interest in a monetary aspect, that's for sure, which is why, historically, the upper 1% will always vote Republican, because Republican tends to be the ones that do not want to tax the rich. These are typical old cliches. I don't even know if they're there anymore. And of course, more liberal Democratic are more of the populace, the working class. This is pretty typical. At least that might not be the entire historical relevance, but it's what has happened in the past few decades. In the future, democracy would be more of a survey of what people need. It's not electing people anymore. People are not elected to do anything. People are put into positions of guidance, put into positions of interacting with a methodology that is universally accepted, which is the scientific method, and this is where education comes into play. It's a very complex notion to consider. It's very controversial because of how many ideologies that are currently in existence today. People ask me all the time why I talk about religion. I talk about religion because it's totally detached from scientific processes and the very nature of how we obtain any form of progress on the planet Earth as a civilization. So it's worth addressing. Ideologies eventually will become obsolete in the future, to the extent that we know them today. The only ideology is not an ideology at all. It is the very processes of nature which has proven to work over and over again, which become utterly self-evident. It isn't a belief system. It goes back to my original point about energy, material resources, and human ingenuity through the scientific method. And until we get that right, there's really nothing else is even worth talking about, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. So I apologize if I didn't answer your question in full, but I'm going to move on now because I'm beginning to run out of time. Number 14. Hi, Peter. Do you think it's possible in the future, I'm misreading this. Do you think it's possible to build houses and other construction work through 3D technology? Interesting. 3D printing technology, such as Z printer or RepRap. Actually, I'm not familiar with those. But I love 3D printing technology, mainly because it's a metaphor for nanotechnology. And I think, I was just reading recently about an individual, I believe in North Carolina, I think it was the University of Wake Forest, I could be wrong now, who was using a printing mechanism to actually create organs. It was an experimental organ creation process, which was absolutely incredible, really incredible. The creation of houses, absolutely. Well, Jacques has the seed concept that I've talked about before, where you create discs with memory metals and foam concrete, which energy is sent through them, and they blow a house up from the foundation up in one swoop, where all of the aspects are just have to be filled in at that point. The house is completely constructed, compressed, and blown up on location. I wouldn't be surprised if a printing aspect could come into play with this as well. There's so many possibilities once we can get advanced materials under control. And I love the seed aspect. I love how everything that we're doing as far as our creation comes from nature. As I denoted before, there are aspects of the human body that react as a nervous system, which are proxies essentially for nanotechnology. It's sort of a mimicry of the way the human organism works, our cellular structures. And the same thing can go for the seed, and I think I've talked about this before, and so has Jacques, how in the seed you have all this memory, that has to be influenced by the environment, and you can put two of the same seed genetically reproduced in two different regions, and the trees are going to grow very different ways depending on what the influences are, meaning that you can take the same concept, make a conglomerate of materials that have memory, put them into an encapsulation, send an exact form of current and make properties surrounding them that can affect the structure, and you can blow up huge physical structures without the need for manual construction. And I think it's a brilliant metaphor, and Jacques has talked about this a lot, and I'm going to try and actually make an example of this in the new film because it's actually a very brilliant notion of how to make self-erecting structures. For those of you that haven't seen Jacques' DVDs, Self-Erecting Structures, I recommend it. So yes, 3D technology, 3D printing technology is a great metaphor. I think it will have actual uses for developing structures in the future, or we'll just get something even better, such as the self-erecting structures that Jacques talks about. But I do love those. I do love that as a metaphor. I was first introduced to that type of 3D printing with Jacques and Roxanne, and it just blew my mind. And even Ray Kurzweil talks about 3D printers, where you'll be able to email somebody a physical edifice, and you'll have a multifaceted printing mechanism that has many different molecular materials through nanotechnology, where you can print out, say, a shirt. Someone can design a shoe for you, and you can print out the shoe that they've designed for you. A whole new level of material acquisition and communication, which would be absolutely phenomenal, which is why nanotechnology and molecular engineering has become so critical, actually in many different ways, not only for convenience, but also just for the very capacity of what's possible with it. Anyway, okay, what am I doing here? Number 15. Do you think possible the reconciliation of social classes and all kinds of distinctions that separate us as human beings to the scientific method, and with that understanding and know who we are really? Am I just not reading well, or are these sentences poorly created? Let me try this one more time. Do you think possible the do you think we will have, let me rephrase this, do you think we can reconcile social classes and distinctions that separate human beings? I think we're going to have to. I think the survival of the species is contingent upon sustainable ideas, meaning that people are going to have to stop complaining about their social classes and their ideas of self-worth, then their notions that they're better than someone else. While there are human value aspects as far as someone being good at something that they're trained in versus someone else, or someone that has a higher genetic propensity for something than someone else, the classic case, or say a savant notion, these issues do not transcend the general equality of the human species. The moment you have egotism and arrogance come into play from one group versus another is the moment things become unstable and unsustainable. And if your goal is the survival of the species, the first thing you want to eliminate is conflict, especially at this day and age with modern warfare and the technology that's on the fingertips of the lunatics at the Pentagon and everywhere else. So, yes, I believe this reconciliation will happen one way or another. I believe in many generations, if we don't destroy ourselves, eventually the lines will become much more blurred with with the races, where we'll have so much interbreeding that the distinction of race will become utterly non-existent ultimately. And then you have social classes, which will become really the problem if there's a monetary system. And that can be removed too, that just as artificial as it was created. Social classes, hierarchy, or artificial concoctions, humans only show tendencies of that in abstraction, and they're easy. They can be built as quickly as they can be taken down. They're not genetic predispositions. So, and to answer your question very simplistically, we must reconcile and get rid of these separations that divide humanity. Otherwise, things are just never going to work. Either we learn to work together, or we're going to kill ourselves, especially in the current environment that's emerging now with the dire scarcity that's on the horizon, unless we move into a new social order that actually takes the earth into account. Number 16. While I agree that the environment, sociological and psychological aspects, while I agree with the environmental, sociological, physiological aspects of the Zeitgeist Movement Venus Project, I fail to realize the importance of the Venus Project's architectural projects. It seems to me that mass awareness of who we are, and where we are going is much more important than how we are going to live in modern cities in the future. It is a very complicated issue that I will try to make simple for radio purposes With technology advancing every day, there is no way to predict how different our lives will be in 20, 50, 100 years from now. A few examples, loopholes in logic would be, number one, Jacques has stated before how we could have built his city structures in the 1930s. Gardening, raising animals, water treatment could also possibly be a thing of the past with the advent of nanotechnologies. I know these technologies don't exist yet, but we are now supposedly 30 to 40 years away from most becoming a reality. This is just about approximately how long I see something like a Venus Project city breaking ground or becoming culturally accepted. I know the easy answer is we have to work with what we have now, unquote. I'm just afraid it will turn out to be a huge waste of resources if we try to feed, house, and clothe the world's population in surely soon-to-be outdated and antiquated methods based on how we live today. Well, I appreciate your point. You have to understand the underlying rationale. Jacques will tell you outright that there's an emergence of society, and everything that he's constructed will eventually be outdated. We all know this. The train of thought is still there, though. There will always be advanced methods that will emerge. We're not trying to use outdated and antiquated methods based on society as we live today. That's not at all what we're trying to do. There's no reason for homes to be built out of wood anymore. There's no reason for a lot of things that we're doing that I won't even go into as far as transportation and everything else. The use of, going back to my original point that I've said a few times in this broadcast, the underlying relevance of the orientation that we're describing is the most important part. Conservation, peak efficiency, and the creation of abundance to satisfy the culture's needs. We do that in the most advanced way possible based on the methods that we're aware of at that time, and we make sure that those methods allow for new emergent technologies to be created to override what we've done. In other words, we don't create an establishment. So if new technologies arise that can make better housing structures, more efficient, more durable, more weather-friendly, more energy conservative, have more energy conservation, then those are immediately implemented. Immediately. This is the nature of the emergence of this type of social order. The important thing we're talking about, and I agree with you, that the importance does not lie in the Venus Project architectural projects or the city systems. It's not those things in and of themselves, as I think I mentioned earlier. It's the underlying train of thought that governs those projects. And as long as that train of thought is maintained, then everything kind of becomes self-evident and will unfold in its own regard. If the goal is sustainability and the use of resources in an efficient and conservative way, then it becomes self-evident. I think I already addressed actually this issue earlier, so I hope I can alleviate your confusion. We're not trying to make another establishment, that's for sure. Everything will change, everything is emergent. By the time we get to doing these technologies, who knows, maybe a great majority of the structural ideas that Jacques has talked about thus far, such as the foam concrete, the memory metals, the blowing things out from disks, the maglev trains, maybe all of that will be obsolete by then because new technology will emerge, and we will openly accept that. So I hope that makes sense. I only have about 10 minutes left, so let me move on very quickly. Number 17, as you mentioned in your first report, I understand that we are hoping for Jacques and Roxanne to make another appearance on Larry King. I was seeking information in the communications team regarding making any progress on any other major media talk shows. Peter, I understand that you're busy working on the third film and planning for Zeitgeist Day. Is there anyone else who would be as articulate and competent as you, Jacques or Roxanne, at disseminating the information for the Zeitgeist Movement and the Venus Project? We need people who are as knowledgeable as you and can respond as well as you have demonstrated under fire. Well, I appreciate the compliment, and all I can say is that I'm hoping to God that people out there are doing what they can to be able to begin to communicate as least as well as I try to. I'm not doing very well today, but in general, to be able to counter any negative opposition, to understand the ideas clearly, to know the fabric of the issue, which is very, very simple. Again, actually, I'm not even going to go on any tangents on this. I definitely need people. This is why I've been so slow to engage the lecture team, because I've been sort of, in the back of my mind, gauging the reactions of the general movement with the emails that I get, with the blog posts that are on the forum, with the questions that I've answered for the last 10 months. And what I've realized is that the foundational focus tends to be missed. And I'm really, 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 really hoping that people will understand this, come forward, and be able to describe this. And for Zeitgeist Day, for example, if people have lecture events, first of all, I should go back to Zeitgeist Day and point out that I want everyone who is engaged in Zeitgeist Day to document everything they're doing. I'm also going to create a page on the website that we have just described, zday2010.org, where we're going to have Ustream embeds of every single event, because it's free. Create a Ustream account, get a simple laptop that has a camera and a mic, doesn't have to be anything special, and make sure you have this documented. I want everyone that does Z-Day to make a YouTube channel as well. Excuse my tangent. Point being is that I'm going to go through and see what people are doing, and I'm hoping to find people that can, in fact, go out there and begin to represent this movement in a very clear, concise fashion and come off in the most respectable and informative way possible. So to answer your question, I have yet to be able to find anyone that I can see give a lecture on it. I want to see people give lectures on it. There's some people in the UK that have started doing this. Again, it's very simple information, but there's so many angles where you have to be able to counter the biases and projections of other people that you have to know how to respond. That takes experience. So please, everyone out there, I really hope that if anything, you're learning how to digest this information, how to interact with people. I really hope that people go back and listen to the other radio broadcasts. There are about 10 months of these. There are hundreds and hundreds of questions that have been answered. I think I've answered almost every question, almost feasible at this stage. I'm going to probably be making a new document to couple in with the orientation guide regarding some new angles of a communication, maybe something smaller, maybe I call it a treatment on communicating the Zeitgeist Movement Venus Project resource-based economy to attempt this. But every chapter leader out there should be, if dedicated, should be working to try and put themselves on a level where they have the confidence to communicate these ideas in a public forum, engaging, quote, debate, even though I don't like that word. It's much more civil to have discussions and sharing ideals, but unfortunately in the world we live in, everyone likes to prove everyone wrong, and that bandwagon unfortunately has to be breached if you want to talk to certain people. So I want to just put it out there. Please, everyone out there, learn and understand that this is a very, very simple direction. It has complex facets. Obviously, we talk about things that are very, very foreign to most people, but the three main attributes that have to be understood are energy, resource management, human ingenuity through the scientific method. And if you can build upon those and the necessity of understanding that optimum efficiency with all these aspects are absolutely paramount, suddenly everything becomes self-evident and you can kind of build from there. So, number 18, hi Peter, I have a pretty basic question that I haven't heard you respond to really. I understand and agree completely that with a successful transformation of a resource-based economy and the removal of our conditions, one would see the disappearance of our world's reliance on war, poverty, politics, and crime. But one incident that I believe will still occur will stem from sex. Sexual hormones and desires account for a fair amount of negativity, frankly. Our senseless desires for material objects and the illusion of power can easily be removed from the Venus Project's proposed plan, but our natural internal desires for sex will never be stopped, and it is the only incident that I see potential trouble. I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Well, first of all, it's a sexual culture, meaning that most of the attributes that create problems in the sexual environment come from cultural inhibitions. Jacques talked about going to these islands when he was a kid and hanging out with indigenous cultures, living with indigenous cultures, that the men never looked at the breasts or ass of a woman. They didn't even think about it. Everyone was naked, so there was no taboos. So the issue, there's so many different aspects of this that are culturally defined, is my point. I'm not going to belabor this too much because I think I've talked about it a few times. The hormonal aspect can be defined culturally. If we didn't have control over our sexual hormones, then men would be running around like chimpanzees, raping every woman that they'd see. Obviously, there's a cultural influence, an educational influence that influences people's behavior and their conduct in society. And that will emerge in many different levels in the future. For example, people do need to begin to think about what it means to bring children into this world at this stage. It's an important thing considering the exponential growth of population. People need to understand that it's one of the most powerful things and environmentally affecting things to bring another organism on this planet, especially at this point in time. because we do not have the infrastructure to support this many people anymore. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is how people deal with jealousy and some of the immaturities and some of the things that are culturally produced, such as I said earlier, we have men that say, well, this is my wife, and it's a form of ownership, and they get personally offended if this or that happens in the relationship. I'm not quite sure if I understand exactly what you mean, thinking about what you're denoting. The hormonal aspect is there, but it can be inhibited. The drive, of course, is there. I think it's safe to say that it's an innate drive, the sexual drive, but it's completely compounded by culture. And I'm sure you recognize that. Why is it that every single movie that Hollywood produces has violence and sex and infidelity? Because this is the tensions and things that people find exciting in this culture. It sells books. People, for some reason, have become so indoctrinated into this worldview, and of course, they live out these sick fantasies in the cultures that they live in. So it's just one of those things. Culture plays a huge role. That's all I can say. So I don't really consider it that big of a deal. It has to be overcome through education, and that's really that's it. I see it as a very minimal problem. In the transition, sure, crimes of jealousy are going to be a problem, but people will begin to have a different worldview when it comes to the way they think about each other. And that's very, very important. And Jacques actually talked about that quite a few times. So I'm not going to belabor it. I only have 2 minutes left, so let me try one more question. Number 19. Hi, Peter. Generally speaking, the right is often associated with freedom and the left with equality. I assume they mean political orientations. However, these two attributes are not really opposites and are not mutually exclusive. Often people assume that in a world of material equality or economic equality, such as the resource-based economy you advocate, where all persons have equal and unbound access to all resources and services, individual freedom would be under threat, particularly when you point out the necessity of increased societal automation to get there. However, I think that what needs to be pointed out to people is that there is no reason that economic equality should lead to cultural homogenization and the loss of individuality. Very good point. Jacques has addressed this on prior radio broadcasts. Our ideas of individuality have been a product of materialism, a product of an advertising culture, a product of a consumer culture. People think their individuality has something to do with the way they dress or the gestures in their communication. Individuality comes from people's mind. Our novelty will always be there because human beings are naturally are going to culminate novel circumstances. So I have the creative aspect of the human culture, I think, will flourish. Human creativity and individuality will flourish, but on a much more profound level. It won't be individuality based on superficial notions of rebellion and all of these things. People will be similar in various ways that will make a society very strong, but yet they will be very individual and expressive in other ways because they will have so much more freedom to explore their lives and explore the world without the inhibiting properties of the monetary system culture where, for example, you have to have a job, live in one location, you can't travel, you can't see the world. Most people live their entire lives with only seeing a fragment of this planet. I'm one of them. I wish I had the freedom to explore this planet. Why is it that people that are the most culturally unique are the ones that have traveled the planet and seen other cultures? I believe culture will expand, not in a way where people are more divisive, but in a way where people have common attributes that they share about the well-being and the need for people to be sustainable in their ideologies and support culture as a whole. And simultaneously, there'll be a tremendous influx of creativity and human ingenuity that will allow for much more much more variance of culture. I think, frankly, this culture today is utterly homogenized. And I have 21 seconds. I'm going to roll the credit music, and I will talk to everybody next week. And I apologize for my coughing and nasally voice. Take care.